How does Christianity see these sort of descendants of Ismail in relation to God's covenant with Abraham?
Ishmael is named by God himself. According to this account, Hagar actually sees God herself. Now, do with that what you will, but that's the way the text treats it. And that's what she herself says.
Do you think that the presence of the Arabs in Acts 2:11, hearing the gospel at the Pentecost, is this symbolic of their inclusion in God's plan for the nations? Would you say that?
100%.
Do you think there's room sort of in modern biblical theology to sort of re-emphasize that, the ancient Arab presence in Scripture?
This future vision of the Middle East should not lead us as Christians to see Arabs as eternal, inevitable enemies, which is the way I would say a lot of mainstream Christianity in the West and other places is seen all along. But we should see the Arab world as having a beautiful destiny according to God.
I think Islam hates us.
They have done nothing except wreak havoc and terror for our faith and our religion.
Professed values of the Western countries, democracy and constitutional and human rights, at least they should speak about this.
And it's like, I feel like religion just is making it worse. They say they believe in God, but I think they're just anxious.
Before we talk about politics, let's look at the fundamental things.
That when we stand up to those who oppress our communities, that Allah accepts from us that as a form of jihad.
And it requires people with guts to follow God in an era that everyone does whatever is right in their eyes.
Will you distance yourself from those who think differently? Or will you join us at the table and talk about what is really important? This is the Al-Ma'idah Initiative, conversation without compromise.
One thing to preface this with is we're focusing on all the Bible passages that are talking about Arabia and the peoples living in it. And some of it might sound harsh. And in order to understand that, you have to understand that when the Bible talks about anybody, some things it says are going to be nice and other things are going to sound, harsh and be severe. So anything it says that sounds like harsh or insulting towards these cultures at the time, also you'll find if you read like the whole context, which we don't have time for today, it's going to have equally strong language for the Israelites and the Jews as well. So it's not picking on anybody, right? This is not a message of Israelites good, Arabs or anyone else bad. But it's speaking in broad terms sometimes of God's judgment on a place, which is not, again, pointed at the Arabs particularly, but that's the kind of language that's being used for some of this. But you got to start with the book of Genesis. So chapter 16, the way the Bible describes the story of Abraham and Hagar and Ishmael goes like this. Now, Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "Behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant, it may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram her husband as a wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me by you, I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abraham said to Sarai, "Behold, your servant is within your power, do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. So basically, Abraham's wife can't get pregnant. So it's Abraham's wife idea that Abraham marries Hagar as well and has a child with her. But when it happens, this sparks a rivalry between Sarai and Hagar. So she runs away. Then it says, the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. He shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are a God of seeing. For she said, truly I have seen him who looks after me. Therefore the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bore Abraham a son, and Abraham called the name of his son, who Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abraham was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. So the first piece of this is Ishmael is named by God himself. And this is your mercy from God. So according to this account, Hagar actually sees God herself. Because whenever you read the angel of the Lord in Genesis and throughout basically the entire Old Testament, people treat that as if they've physically seen God. Now, do with that what you will, but that's the way the text treats it. And that's what she herself says. So Ishmael is blessed by God and is promised to be a multitude. So there's no anti-Ishmael sentiment in Genesis. Now it does describe him being like a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him. That sounds like an insult, but it is not an insult. There's plenty of time where there's where sort of animal descriptive metaphors are used for children of Israel as well. It's a description, it's not an insult. Remember, this is part of a blessing from God about them being a great multitude.
Yeah, I actually have a question regarding, something similar to that. So we know that, in Genesis, many Arab tribes are said to descend from Ishmael and Keturah. I would like you to explain who's Keturah exactly.
Okay, I'm going to get to that.
All right.
So
and also one more thing,
yeah.
so you can get to that also. How does Christianity see these sort of descendants of Ishmael in relation to God's covenant with Abraham?
So that's actually exactly what the next part deals with, right? So in Genesis 17, this is when God promises Isaac. So God meets Abraham and says, as for Sarah, your wife, you shall not call her by the name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations, kings, and people shall come from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. God said, no, but Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful and multiply greatly. He shall father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year. So basically what it says, the covenant goes through Isaac, but Ishmael and his descendants will be blessed. So that's basically the way Genesis sees that. So Ishmael and the other sons of Abraham are not part of the covenant, but they still get a blessing.
Okay. And what about the Keturah? Who's Keturah?
Okay. So in Genesis 25, it says, Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah. She bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan fathered Sheba and Dedan. So a lot of people believe that Jokshan is Khatan.
Yeah, I've heard that before. I think many of the Qahtans claim this also.
Yeah. And then Sheba would be like the sort of Yemeni region, Kingdom of Saba, Sheba.
Yep.
And then I only actually realized this when I was there, but Dedan is where modern day Al Ula is.
Yeah. Yeah, it's and Mada'an Saleh, where that place is as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I didn't realize that until I was standing in it, eating in a restaurant, and I look at the Wikipedia page. Oh, it's a biblical place. So that inspired me to go look at all that. So yes, the Bible treats Abraham as the progenitor of Arabia, basically. Like that's a connection the Bible sees. So not just from Ishmael, but through Midian, which is in Hijaz, through Sheba, and which is South Arabia, Yemen, Dedan, sort of Hijaz area. So it's not imaginary. This connection, according to the Bible, is a real connection.
Okay, so we know in Deuteronomy 18:18, it says, "I will raise up a prophet like you from among their brethren, who exactly are the brethren of." So the question is, who do you think are the brethren? Because we talked about this before, but this is really interesting to me. I mean, I'm not trying to get a certain answer. I just want to know, what is the understanding from you when we talk about the brethren of the Israelites in sort of the biblical language? Who are these people, and could they include the Ishmaelites? Although you did answer that question with the question before that, but I just want to hear the answer pertaining this question particularly.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked it. So, in the context of Deuteronomy, in one chapter before Deuteronomy 18, in chapter 17, they have the rules for king, where it says the king must be one of your brothers. A foreigner must not rule over you. So in the context of Deuteronomy, everyone who is not an Israelite is a foreigner. So Israel itself has 12 tribes. So brothers mean people who are part of the tribes.
The other tribe.
So
okay.
The Ishmaelites aren't really ever even discussed again after Genesis. All these other tribes start to become more prominent. So Midian, for example, is a much bigger deal after this, and
which is not in Arabia.
Midian is,
or not considered Arab.
Well, no. So Midian is a Hijaz, is a kind of tribe in Hijaz.
Okay.
And
okay.
What Genesis basically seems to suggest is that by the time of Joseph, which is a few generations after Ishmael, that the Midianites are then considered Ishmaelites. Now, that sounds like a contradiction, but it isn't, because over a few generations, clearly Ishmael is said to have 12 princes as sons. So there can easily be intermarriage between Ishmaelites and the Midianites. So I think the way you start to hear the sons of Ishmael's sons and descendants more than you hear Ishmael's name itself at this point.
Now, I want to ask you about three particular places and what they sort of what are they in the Bible, and I want to ask you about Dedan, Kedar, and Sheba.
Okay, that's great. So Dedan is mentioned several times, mostly just in passing. The most direct thing that's ever said to Dedan comes in the book of Isaiah. And this is actually using the word Arabia here, which is one of the first times the word Arabia is used in the Bible. So Isaiah 21 says, "The oracle concerning Arabia, in the thickets in Arabia you will lodge, O caravans of Dedanites. To the thirsty bring water. Meet the fugitive with bread, O inhabitants of the land of Tema. For they have fled from the swords, from the drawn swords, from the bent bow, and from the press of battle. For thus says the Lord, within a year, according to the year of a hired worker, all the glory of Kedar will come to an end, and the remainder of the archers of the mighty men of the sons of Kedar will be few, for the Lord, the God of Israel, has spoken. So what that seems to be saying is there's a calamity coming to Kedar, and that is most likely the military campaign of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, who just wreaked havoc across that whole region. And so the Dedanites are being told to prepare food and water for these incoming refugees who are coming from Kedar, basically. So that's kind of what it's describing. So Dedan is described as this trading empire. It's described as this people who are doing business everywhere. It's mostly talked about in kind of neutral fashion. Sheba is actually really important. And the first time we hear about Sheba is in 1 Kings 1:10. It says, "Now when the queen of Sheba heard the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions. She came to Jerusalem with a very great retinue, with camels bringing spices and very much gold and precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she told him all that was on her mind. And Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing hidden from the king that he could not explain to her. And when the king and queen of Sheba had seen all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his officials, and the attendance of the servants of their clothing, there was no breath left in her." And then she gives him this large gift of gold and spices, like there has never been in Israel up until that point. And then in Second Chronicles it says, "Now the weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold, beside that which the explorers and the merchants bought. And all the kings of Arabia and all the governors of the land bought gold and silver to Solomon." So Sheba becomes important, and Arabia in general becomes really important in the time of Solomon. And we actually have archaeological evidence of Sabaean pottery present in the land of Israel at that time, because in the time of Solomon, there's this massive trade network built with Arabia. And this plausibly allows for massive Jewish influence in the region, and also lays the groundwork for it being a good place for Jews to retreat to when Nebuchadnezzar destroys everything else. Nebuchadnezzar is kind of this apocalypse level event for all the civilizations of the region.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think that the presence of the Arabs in Acts 2:11, hearing the gospel at the Pentecost, is this symbolic of their inclusion in God's plan for the nations? Would you say that?
100%. In fact, because all these messianic prophecies really kind of like start in earnest. There's some before, but they start in earnest from Solomon and David's time. The imagery is all about this. So, for example, in the book of Isaiah, which is one of the biggest sort of prophetic books in the Old Testament, listen to the way it describes the people coming in. "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For behold, darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. But the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will be seen upon you. And nations shall come to your light, and the kings to the brightness of your rising. Lift up your eyes all around, and see they gather together. They come to you, your sons from afar, and your daughters shall be carried on the hip. They shall see and be radiant, and they shall exult. Because the abundance of the sea shall be turned to you, the wealth of the nations shall come to you. A multitude of camels shall cover you. The young camels of Midian and Ephah, all those from Sheba shall come. They shall bring gold and frankincense, and shall bring good news, the praise of the Lord. All the flocks of Kedar shall be gathered to you. The rams of Nebaioth shall minister to you. They shall come with acceptance on my altar, and I will beautify my house." So notice that's basically kind of all of the people groups talked about as being the Arabs in the Bible, almost all of them are mentioned there. Like Kedar, Nebaioth, both sons of Ishmael, Midian, sons of, and Sheba, sons of Keturah. So it describes a future in which all of Arabia is both coming to be part of God's people and receives acceptance by God in Jerusalem. So when Acts 2 is talking about that, it is certainly, referring back to that. Also, in that same chapter, it says that the truth of God going out to the nations starts at Tarshish first. Now, funnily enough, the first Christian to bring Christianity to non-Jews is Paul, who is from Tarsus or Tarshish. So he's the one that starts it. And the first Christian that is recorded as having gone to Arabia is actually the Apostle Paul.
Paul, the same Paul that the one and only Paul.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. You mentioned Isaiah 21, and there's also Jeremiah 25. These mention oracles against Arabia. In your belief, do you believe this is like purely historical, or is there sort of a eschatological meaning for Christians today?
No, I think it's historical. If you read the context of Isaiah and Jeremiah, what is going on there is God is judging the nations, including Israel, and the judgment he's talking about is clearly the coming Babylonian invasion. That it's not, the book of Isaiah is not ambiguous about this. If you read it long enough, you'll see this. So Isaiah does two things, right? It talks about shorthand things, which are talking about the immediate future, and then it's talking about the long-term, the arrival of the Messiah and the long-term future. Everything in the short-term future for Israel and the nations around it is almost entirely negative, and then everything in the future for both Israel and all the Arabs in Isaiah 60 is entirely positive. So the story the Bible is telling is not one that everything is good for Isaac and bad for Ishmael and his descendants, because God made a promise to Ishmael too. It's a future where Ishmael's descendants and the Arabs are included in God's blessing in the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament.
Do you think there's room sort of in modern biblical theology to sort of re-emphasize that, the ancient Arab presence in Scripture in general? And, what can today, there are Arab Christians, obviously, and they still exist in the Middle East. So what can today's Arab Christians sort of take from the fact that Arabs are part of this sort of biblical narrative? Is it a pride or is it a responsibility?
It should be zero pride and 100% responsibility. And I think if you're a Christian who's Arab or non-Arab, we shouldn't. This future vision of the Middle East should not lead us as Christians to see Arabs as eternal, inevitable enemies, which is the way I would say a lot of mainstream Christianity in the West and other places is seen all along. But we should see the Arab world as having a beautiful destiny according to God, and we should be invested accordingly in the future by being invested in that part of the world, by making friends, by having conversations, by having conversations which can make Christianity clearer and getting, past a lot of these cultural barriers and getting past of the us versus them mentality that's defined us for the last, since 9/11.
You might have a lot of Arab listeners, so if you haven't mentioned it already, what could be a message to these listeners, either Muslims or Christians, that you sort of want to give about their place in sort of your understanding in God's story?
Yeah, so what I believe as a Christian reading the book of Isaiah. Isaiah 60 verse 6 mentions the Arabs bringing gold, frankincense, and good news to Israel. So, as Christians, we believe in a future salvation of the Jews. We believe that it's their destiny to embrace Jesus as the Messiah, and the world will transform for the better when that happens. Now, let's be clear. There have been plenty of people who call themselves Christians who have tried to do that coercively. And at no point should we be trying to affect this reality through coercion. But in Isaiah 60, we don't see coercion, we don't see conquest. We see trade, we see wealth, and we see blessing, and we see the announcement of good news. And that's the same word as gospel is, right? The gospel simply means good news. So I would suggest that any Arab Christian who is wondering what their place in the world is should start working towards this future to proclaim good news, both to other Arabs who are non-Christians, and to think of ways to explain this to the Jews as well.
Yeah, I mean, especially, the people, especially in the United States, they don't understand that there are, especially before the invasion of Iraq in 2003, there was a big Arab community in Iraq. The Chaldean Christians were there. You had the Maronite Christians in Lebanon. You had the Coptic Christians in Egypt. So they, obviously, after these wars in the Middle East, these recent wars, and especially the invasion in 2003, they lived outside. But the Middle East has always been a place of different religions that lived among each other. At one time, Baghdad in Iraq had a third of its population as Jews. Most of the Jews that I wouldn't say most, but a big proportion of the Jews that are in Israel today, they came from Baghdad. They came from Iraq. So it's people, I think, in the West tend to don't. They, when you talk about the Middle East, they think about Islam, which is true, but they tend to forget that all the Abrahamic religions came from this part of the world. So and they are a part of the region. So and a part of the history of the region. So
yeah, and I believe part of the future of the region as well. And I think to Arab Christians who are listening to this, I think, and I'd say this lesson applies to Muslims as well, that often you ask if this should be a point of pride or a point of responsibility. What John the Baptist said to the Jews of his time is, do not say we are children of Abraham, because God is able to raise up from these rocks children of Abraham. Everyone, if they've inherited something, whether that be Christianity or Islam, we can get complacent in assuming we're part of the right group, right? That we've inherited what's good and right, and we're part of the righteous side. And it's a responsibility in each and every person to seek God for themselves, rather than being accepted what is handed down to them without question. So I would say this: if you're Christian or if you're Muslim, you need to do the work to ask yourself the question, how do I know, how do I believe, what work have I done to examine whether what I believe is actually the truth, and seek God and figure out what God himself actually wants from me. And if you're not willing to do that, it doesn't matter if you're Christian or Muslim. Being a Christian who doesn't seek God, who doesn't try to obey God, doesn't put you in any different category than being a non-Christian, right? You could be Jewish or Muslim, and that would be, and being called Christian in name only would be absolutely no advantage to you. So this is a great time in history to really take the time to really ask yourself, why do I believe what I believe? Examine the sources for yourselves, think about these things, and get past the, well, I believe this has been handed down to me.
Well, that's fantastic. How's your Arabic going?
Shway. I have a friend
Well, good luck.
who's moving here for a few years to work on their PhD. I'm hoping to get some like regular practice in with them.
Well, yeah, you need the practice. You should use Twitter Spaces to try to use your Arabic there. There are spaces that are for Arab speakers that are new to the language. I can even get you to know some of the. I know people that learned Arabic. They speak it pretty well. They're a bit more advanced than you. There's a Bosnian guy that I know and a Russian guy. They probably can give you a lot of tips, how they reached where they reached, if you would like.
Yeah, I'll take all the input I can get. So the other thing you will see in the Bible is that you start to see the one thing. Another interesting link I found is one of the opponents of the rebuilding of the temple was a guy called Geshem the Arab, who some people think is actually a guy called Geshem, who was the king of Kedar. And so
from Najd.
Yeah. Now, we don't know if it's actually him or whether that's just kind of a common name from the era, but it's actually interesting that once you get this time in history, things start to get slightly more sort of cemented.
Even the names when you because when you go after Adnan or Ma'ad bin Adnan, the names are very not Arabic, and we don't consider it the lineage of the Arabs usually stops at Adnan when it comes to exact names. So from Adnan all the way to Ismail, they say there's between 50 to 150 names. They're not sure. But even the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, asked the Arabs to not record this because we're not sure about the names exactly. So if we're not sure, we're not supposed to record them. But if you do go ahead and read the names that are recorded today, they sound like the names that you just mentioned now.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So one thing that we kind of became a little bit obsessed with while we were in Hijaz was Paul's journey into Arabia, because it's all very mysterious. So, especially we're thinking of this in Madain Salah, because we know that Paul at least went to the region of the Nabateans. So there's two clues here, and Paul actually talks about Arabia more than anyone, is kind of the only person who really talks about Arabia in the New Testament. So there's a lot more about Arabia in the Old Testament, and there was the passage in Acts you brought up, which is there. But then Paul talks about Arabia quite a lot. So in Galatians 1:15, he says, "But when he who had set me apart before I was born, and who called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anybody, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away into Arabia and returned again to Damascus." So he becomes a Christian on the road to Damascus and becomes a Christian in Damascus. And then he goes on this 3-year journey into Arabia. And we have no idea what he was doing there. But the one thing we do know about it is 2 Corinthians 11:32 mentions in passing, "At Damascus, the governor under King Aretas was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me, but I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hands." So whatever Paul is doing, he's doing it in the Nabatean kingdom. So the Nabatean kingdom at the time is in Petra, covers Hegra or Madain Salah, and it goes all the way up to Damascus. That's the territory they've conquered. But Paul is going on some sort of 3-year journey in Arabia, and we don't really know where, except at least to Petra, maybe further. And what I kind of think is happening here and what Ibars thinks as well, is that Paul's pattern is to go to the communities of Jews who are somewhere, right? He preaches to them first, then he preaches to the Gentiles. So it seems like that's probably what he's doing in Arabia as well. So he probably went at least as far to Petra.
Do you think he's looking for the Jews that are in Arabia?
Very plausibly. Okay. So if you follow that route down, it will take you from Petra to Madain Salah to Dedan and then to Khaybar.
Khaybar, yeah. Khaybar, and there's actually a city before that called Tayma, which is on the border of Jordan. It's a farming city. That's also a place where Jews used to live. So it'll be the triangle of Tayma, Khaybar, and Medina. These are the during the life of the Prophet Muhammad. Maybe before that, the namings could be different. Yeah.
So we don't know exactly what Paul was doing there, right? We're given like zero details. So it's a mystery. But what we do know is what he was doing there was significant enough that the king of the Nabateans was after him. He's a wanted man as he's leaving Damascus. So it's not as if he's just like meditating in a cave somewhere. He's preaching. So it's very probable that Christianity in Arabia is really started by the Apostle Paul himself.
So it's first-hand conversion, let's say, or transmission of the religion.
Right. Which would mean that Christianity in Arabia, as we've seen from Acts 2 and we've seen from Paul, goes right back to the very beginning of Christianity. It's not a later addition. It's kind of foundational in the Christian world to begin with.
Which makes sense.
And also, Paul also mentions that Mount Sinai, where Moses was, is in Arabia.
Yep. Yeah. Did you get a chance to see that area, Jabal al-Lawz?
No, I didn't this time.
In Tabuk?
I really want to go, but the what you have, so you've got this whole sort of history of Mount Sinai in the region, and Moses flees to Midian when he's escaping from Pharaoh, and Jethro is called the priest of Midian. That's his father-in-law, and this man is treated as a believer. Now, there's later on in the book of Numbers, there are Midianites which are not believers that actively try and lead the Israelites into sexual sin. But there's also believers in Midian as well. So I think the way you can trace that biblically is you start with Abraham and his sons being believers. And so Ishmael and his sons would have been believers in one God. And then you have the general creep in of polytheism, but not completely. So you'd have some trace of monotheism in the Arabs from the time of Abraham himself. And there's evidence for that in the Bible with people like Jethro. And in fact, so the book of Job, right, who's Ayub in the Quran, I believe.
Correct, yep.
So they're also non-Israelites, but Job is described as a righteous, God-fearing man. But he's again also descended from Abraham as well. He's an Edomite. So that area is Petra as well. And it's very plausible that the people of Ad mentioned in the Quran are the Edomites mentioned in the Bible. Because the Edomites are people who live in rocks in North Arabia, around the sort of area which is now Petra, and they're described the same way as in the Quran. And so to see linguistically how you can get from Edom to Ad is not a difficult linguistic jump.
I think there's a lot to learn in the history of Arabia. And I mean, do you think this archaeology that will pop up, with this new movement with archaeology in Saudi Arabia, do you think this will add to the knowledge?
Yeah, I think I think as
What are you expecting? What are you expecting?
okay, I have some like pretty out there. I have some pretty out there things, and I have some more realistic things. So with the more realistic things, I think you'll see way more early Christian literature in Arabia. I think you'll see more and more details about Judaism and Christianity in Arabia, and now that people are more sort of free and open to talking about those things. And I think you'll see a lot of, especially in kind of rock inscriptions and stuff. What I'm actually most interested in, as far as my kind of out there theories, is I want to know about Saleh and Shuaib, because I've developed kind of a slightly outlandish conspiracy theory about them both.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't place Shuaib yet, but here's my theory for Saleh, right? So traditionally, Saleh is put like way in the past, like thousands of years ago. But the Quran says that he is a prophet to the people of Thamud and to Madain Saleh or Al-Hijr. Those are not thousands of years old. They're like, Thamud is from like 800 BC to like 480. So it's not in the sort of Noah's time. It's, and Al-Hijr really has its heyday from about the time of Jesus to 106 AD. So if you're placing a prophet sometime before the collapse of Madain Saleh, which is about 106 AD, is when it kind of gets abandoned. That you've got to have somebody living in that sort of time, and we have a prophet who was in that area at the time, which would be the Apostle Paul. And when the Apostle Paul was in the Greek-speaking world, you would have he'd go by the name Paulus, right? When he's in the Aramaic or Semitic language-speaking world, he goes by Saul. So it's not a crazy jump how Saul could become Saleh. So this is a kind of fresh, kind of out there theory we kind of developed driving on the road from the Dammam airport to Jubail. It's not like super well formulated yet, but I'm actually really curious if any more data about Saleh or Shuaib come up. So I think
Saul and Saleh is much closer than many of the biblical names that we have for other people. I mean, like Yahya and John are very, very different. So I mean, there's no problem with the similar, and having the name similar or not as similar as one would expect. With languages, it sort of changes.
Yeah. So the one problem with that theory, there's a few problems, but the thing that's going to get pushed, the thing that's going to get pushed back at that theory would be, again, the traditional identification of the timing of Saleh by sort of later Muslims. Not really from the Quran itself. The other problem with that is Shuaib mentions Saleh when he's warning the people of Midian. So if Saul is Saleh, I have absolutely no idea who Shuaib is yet. I can't solve that problem yet. But it doesn't mean I won't be able to ever, but that's kind of what I'm interested in.
Do you know his timeline, though? You know his timeline very well.
Shuaib or Saul?
Yeah. No, Shuaib. I think his timeline is... I'm not sure. I'm asking you because I'm not very sure if his timeline is...
So here's the thing. The way Muslim scholars put him already doesn't work, because they say that he's Jethro, he's Moses' father-in-law. The Quran, though, doesn't say he's Moses' father-in-law. And Moses would have been around 1500 BC, which, if Saleh is speaking to the people of Thamud, they're coming almost 1,000 years after Moses. So Saleh cannot be before Moses if he's speaking to the people of Thamud. So the way that people are putting the puzzle together now doesn't make sense of the historical data. So you'd basically have to say, if you're going to keep the timeline of Saleh being like contemporaneous to like Noah or a little later than that, then you'd have to say there's another Al-Hijr, there's another Madain Saleh, there's another Thamud that we just don't know about, and the traditional identification of those places is wrong. And that's kind of how you'd have.
And the Quran doesn't mention their
Exactly,
timeline, right?
It doesn't. So there's no problem with the Quran in that timeline. The problem comes with the sort of traditional dating of those places. So I think I'm actually really curious to do more study on those, and I'm curious if more archaeological evidence is going to come out and deal with that stuff.
I think if I'm not mistaken, Thamud, U'ad, and if you talk about Shu'aib or Saleh, they were before Abraham in the Quran. I think they're mentioned that they are before Abraham in the Quran, but I'm not sure. I have to double check.
Yeah, let's check it out. If anybody has any opinions on this, please, or data we're missing, please tell us in the comments. But again, if they're before Abraham, then the dating of exactly who those people are and when they lived has to be like, radically rearranged. There's pieces of the puzzle which just don't fit together right now. And doesn't necessarily mean the Quran is wrong. Although as a Christian, I don't have a particular problem with that. But obviously a Muslim would have a problem with that. But it may mean the way people are putting the puzzle together is incorrect. And I'm curious to examine that more in the future.
So I just checked it out right now. It says Saleh and Shu'aib, the Prophet Saleh and Shu'aib, peace be upon them, came after Abraham and not before him. And this is the historical. So you have Abraham, and he was like from the main prophets, and he became, he came after Noah, before Moses, probably around 2000 years BC, so 2000 BC. And then you have Saleh, which was sent to Thamud in the northwest of Arabia, Madain Saleh, and he was after Qawm Ad, after Ad, whom Hud was sent to. So we have Saleh to Qawm Thamud, and then before that you had Hud to Qawm Ad. Okay, so then you have Shu'aib ursil ila Midian, so he was sent to Midian, and he came after Lot. So Shu'aib obviously came after Abraham, for a good while. So you have, so you have Shu'aib and Saleh after Abraham in this sort of in the Islamic Muslim understanding.
Right. So definitively, the Quran puts Saleh, like Shu'aib, after Saleh. Like the exact timeline of that doesn't really give that. I mean, and the Quran generally isn't speaking to historical timelines all that much anyway. So I think there's all sorts of mysteries to be solved there. And again, my speculation is out there. I'm not risking my career on asserting, yes, the Prophet Saleh is definitely Saul, but I think it's plausible.
Let's make a bet. If you get it wrong, if you get it wrong, you have to do the Shahada. This is our bet.
I'll do the pre-Islamic Shahada.
No worries.
Well, guys, thank you for listening to this conversation about Arabia in the Bible. And thank you for being here with me today and for last week's episode. We'll see you guys next time.